A loud bang echoed around the ship as a shiver ran through the hull of their vessel. They'd finally made it. "Clamps engaged," Cora called out, still hunched over the small screen in her cockpit. She couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Almost 700 hours since they had left Pegasus Station, and now, for the first time, and she didn't even know how long, they had made landfall on a planet called Destea, with an almost real atmosphere and gravity. Not some small rundown station somewhere out there. All that stood between life and death was the continued functioning of a computer system 50 years out of date. Down here, oxygen was produced by plants and stuff, and not filtered and processed over and over again. A message popped up on the screen. "Please leave your vessel. Decontamination will start in 5 minutes." She looked over and could see her only crewmate, a young man called Theodore, giving her a nod while pulling off the straps of the safety harness. First, they needed to leave the ship and wait in one of those quarantine chambers for a few hours while it got pretty much sterilized. One couldn't be too careful with pathogens after all. After that had finished, they would get a decontamination as well, before they would finally be able to leave that part of the port and meet the local merchants. Cora was glad they had specialized in hauling inorganic freight. There was nothing worse than getting something either edible or, God forbid, alive through such a checkpoint. They'd have to flag the ship for manual inspection, wait around for a team of agents, then fill out a whole bunch of documents. It really wasn't worth the effort. Cora untangled the harness as well and stood up from the seat. Her muscles felt strained already. The gravity in this place was just slightly higher than the artificial one they flew around in, but even such a minor difference made one feel off for at least 10 hours. "Let's go so they can start." She turned and walked out of the cockpit, followed by Theodore, who had the cargo manifest with him. They passed through the living area and then the small cots they had been sleeping in before, finally reaching the door. It felt strange, she thought, stepping out and onto a new planet. Not so long ago, people would have lost their minds if they had been able to simply visit a new star system. But now, with the big expansion, humanity had conquered so much already. She shot Theodore a glance, then pressed the button to activate the doors. Air blew in, the moment the hydraulic mechanism whirred and opened, and for the first time in her life, she breathed the air of this planet. It, just like every other world and station they had visited, had a very distinctive smell. Something sour was in the air, Cora thought. Maybe even a whiff of rot. She could hear Theodore mumbling a curse behind her, but didn't react to it. Someone might be watching them. And there were people everywhere feeling offended if some newcomers complained about stuff like the smell of their planet. Cora stepped out of the ship and into the hallway that led to only one door. This part of the port was completely isolated, she knew. Not even the tiniest amount of air from their ship would be let out into the atmosphere. At least not until it was sterilized. She could feel and hear Theodore following her along the walkway, and into a room that looked exactly the same as the ones on any station or planet everywhere else. Blank metal walls, an uncovered ceramic floor, wall-mounted chairs, a single small table, and at the far end 4 doors. One would lead to the main part of the building, but that one would only open after the operators were sure they were clean. The other doors were for toilets, a decontamination room, and a sick bay, in case anyone in here displayed any strange symptoms and needed to be quarantined even further. Cleo sighed, waited for Theodore to enter the room, and then listened for the sound of the door behind them falling shut again. "Now we wait," she told him, and walked over to the chairs at the wall, then sat down on the first one. They really were just as uncomfortable as everywhere else, she thought. Then again, there wasn't much that could be done about that. This room here as well could be sterilized by the push of a single button somewhere in the command center. And since anything made of cloth or other soft materials might give some pathogens refuge, people had decided to simply forgo comfort for the new arrivals to make processing them easier. Theodore sat down next to her while she stared up at the ceiling. Metal, the same as all the rest. Cora couldn't help but shiver. There was an emergency protocol in place, she knew. If people in here rampaged and tried to get outside, anything inside could be incinerated at a moment's notice. Not that that had happened before, at least as far as Cora knew. There were some stories, but those were most likely tall tales spun by other pilots. Still, the thought persisted, and she could feel her fingers shaking slightly as her eyes wandered around the area, looking for valves or the like that could flood the room with gas before setting it on fire. "So, how long until we get out of here?" Theodore sounded curious, but not nervous. She chuckled and gave him a glance. "Don't really know. We don't even know if they've decontaminated the ship yet. Normally, we should get a few updates. Maybe they're all on break." The answer didn't satisfy her crewmate, she knew. He was rolling his eyes, then stretched out his legs and started humming. Cora continued looking around the room. There were 3 speakers on the walls, metal monstrosities that hadn't activated once since they arrived here. Strange, she thought. Shouldn't they at least get some kind of greeting? An automated announcement, welcoming them to Destea. She was accustomed to not being greeted in person, but absolutely no acknowledgement of their presence? Really? Minutes passed, while her crewmate's humming changed into whistling, then back. Cora stood up from the uncomfortable chair and started walking around the room. It was big enough to hold the crew of a giant vessel, but right now the area was completely empty, apart from her and Theodore. Was that the reason why they hadn't been greeted? Because they weren't important enough? No, that would be dumb. There was nothing else for people in the command center to do right now. Right? Cora reached the wall where the door out of the quarantine room was located. A screen was right next to it. Normally, it was used to tell people what kind of process was going on, filtering the air or checking the pathogen levels and stuff like that. But right now, the screen was completely black. "I think there's a problem here," Cora mumbled, then heard her crewmate's humming stop as he jumped up and came toward her. "Have you seen any sign of anyone else being here?" He didn't even answer, just walked up beside her, then started tapping the screen. No reaction. Cora felt a strange chill. She wasn't completely sure, but had there really not been other ships in orbit? The planet, as they descended, hadn't seemed off either. right? Maybe it was just this port? There were more of them strewn across the surface. What if it had been shut down or abandoned? No. If that was the case, they wouldn't have been led here by the automated system, and claws wouldn't have engaged as soon as they had touched down. There was no way this could be an administrative error. Right? Cora looked over at her crewmate, who had now started tapping the sides of the screen that still seemed dead.
Doesn't look like some kind of malfunction,
he said, now scratching the stubble on his chin. The silence here was eerie. It felt like they were the only people around. Maybe the port had been abandoned after all. But why then were the lights on? Why were the systems running at all? Cora couldn't make heads or tails of it. Instead of worrying, they should try and find out if anyone could hear them. She stepped to the door and looked through the small window into the hallway that should lead to the reception area. No one was out there either.
"Hello?"
she shouted, while turning around and waving her arms. If anyone was looking at the camera feed, they should already know that they were here. So why was no one answering? The speakers stayed dead, and there was no message popping up on any screen she could see.
"Anyone out there?"
Her voice echoed back from the metal walls, and Cora felt a chill. This was getting unnerving. There was no answer. Again.
"Can you open the door from this side?"
She asked her crewmate, and found him immediately shaking his head.
"I can't even loosen the screen. On the bright side, I don't think the lock is fully engaged. So, we might be able to force open the door. But that's the only thing I can think of right now."
Cora looked around the room once more. The small cameras were all staring at them, but no one had bothered to answer.
"If you don't give us a reply, we'll come in on our own,"
she threatened. Silence filled the room. Shit, Cora thought. This wasn't ideal. Far from it, if she was honest. She had never seen anything like it. But then again, it wasn't like they could go back to the ship and just take off. Not as long as the clamps were engaged. Shaking her head, she shot her crewmate a look.
"Help me with this one,"
Cora said, and walked over to the closest chair at the wall. It didn't take them more than a few minutes until she finally managed to loosen one of the plates enough to wrench it free.
"This is going to be loud. If anyone is here besides us, they'll definitely wake up and come running,"
she cautioned her crewmate as they made their way back to the door. It took them 20 minutes of pulling and pushing before they managed to get the tip of the plate into a tiny gap in the door. Then another 5 to open it wide enough to get a hand through. Cora was sweating and cursing throughout, and even her crewmate had stopped humming or whistling now. The door was heavy, strong, made to be used to shield the rest of the installation from the blast, if they ever did incinerate the quarantine room. But what made it all even worse was that there still was no sound besides their own echoing through the empty hallway behind. No one had come to take a look. Not a single person. She could feel the hair on the nape of her neck standing up as she looked out through the gap. Why was no one around? What had happened to this place? She got no answer back, and took the now deformed plate and rammed it into the gap again to use it as a lever. door opened bit by bit, until Cora finally thought she could push her head and body through.
I'll go first,
she told Theodore, who nodded at her, completely out of breath. It was tight. Far too tight for her liking, if she was honest. But slowly she managed to squeeze herself through the gap and into the empty hallway. Her crewmate followed behind, almost getting stuck a few times, but not even a minute later, both of them had made it out of the quarantine room. If she had thought it was eerie before, Cora now felt even worse about their situation. No one had come. There was no alarm that the quarantine room area had been breached. No sign of anyone, even in the common area that should be up ahead. She couldn't stop herself from shivering slightly as she and Theodore slowly walked through the silent hallway. The door was located at the end, but at least that one looked far smaller and less heavy than the one they had pried open before. Cora took a deep breath and smelled the same sour stench in the air again, and sped up a bit to walk in front. This was nerve-wracking. They didn't even have a single weapon between them. Whatever had happened here, well, it wasn't like they had any choice but to go and take a look. She reached the door at the end, touched the handle, and heard its hydraulics coming to life as the entrance hissed and opened up in front of her. What greeted her was a wide-open, brightly lit area, completely devoid of life. A shiver crawled up her spine as she took a step inside. Theodore was close behind her, and he seemed to have the same thought she had. What the hell happened here?
Hello? Anyone there?
Cora called out, but got no answer. She looked back and could see a giant H over the door they had come out of. Well, at least they now knew where they had to go to get out of here again, she thought with a humorless smirk on her lips.
I don't want to be here,
she heard her crewmate say, and this time she couldn't fault him for his words. Cora felt exactly the same way. Slowly, they moved into the middle of the room, unsure of what to do next. No one was here. No one spoke.
I think we should get out of here as quickly as possible,
Cora said, feeling completely isolated, yet exposed. She looked around the hall and could see other doors leading to different quarantine chambers, and one double-wide one out toward the exits. There was sunlight there. Cora shivered and turned away.
Where's the command center?
She asked out loud, but didn't expect an answer. Theodore hadn't been here before either, and she highly doubted the port would put a fat sign on it anyway.
I'll check this side. You take the other one. Look for a door with access restricted on it, or something like that,
she told him, gave him a pat on the back, and watched him flinch. Yeah, he was tense as well, just like her. The quicker they got their ship released, the better. Cora jogged to the far side of the Great Hall and started walking along the doors there. This building had 3 levels, which meant it was much smaller than some of the other planet ports. Yet finding something here with just the 2 of them would take quite a bit of time. She looked around, but could only see more of those same doors marked with single letters here, and shook her head. Searching for it down here was pointless. With a gesture, Cora got Theodore's attention and then pointed upwards. It might be smarter to at least start from the top, she thought. and looked around for a way to get up there. 2 elevators in the back and a sign with stairs next to it. Theodore followed her as she started jogging toward them. Her footfalls echoed around the empty building, giving it this strangely ominous feeling. She really wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. They reached the elevators. Cora pressed a button and could see the door opening. Everything was working normally. Why? The fact that it was made her feel even worse. Something must have happened here. Theodore looked pale as she pressed a button for the uppermost level and the elevator started to move. Through the glass front, they could see the floor of the hall moving away. And Cora only now got a feeling for the true size of the building. She had seen space stations almost smaller than this, she thought. Whoever had built it must have tried to make a statement with its height. They passed the next floor and finally arrived at the top. Cora could feel herself shivering as the door opened, and they looked out over a circular walkway around the building's interior circumference.
Let's get this over with,
she said, while chewing her lip. This time, they didn't split up. Cora could feel her crewmate close behind her as they walked from door to door until they finally found what they had been looking for. Main Command stood on a sign over the entrance, and for a moment, she wrestled with herself whether she should try knocking first. If it all was just a big misunderstanding... No, that was completely out of the question, she thought. There was no way someone was in there. They would have said or done something to make contact if that were the case. She looked over at Theodore, who gave her a simple nod, then reached out and touched the handle. Hydraulics whirred, and the door opened automatically. Cora wasn't sure if she liked that. Some part of her was still hesitant. Those doors shouldn't just open for anyone, right? But it had. Something was really wrong here. She walked on, followed by her crewmate. The air inside felt strangely stale as Cora made her way through a small room with hooks and jackets on the wall. Then into the bigger command center, where all the screens and computers were located. No one was there, she thought, and felt another shiver now crawling down her spine. The room itself looked normal. There were 3 rows of computers with screens, all still running, while in the back, a big terminal had a blinking message on it. Cora walked around the rows until she reached the biggest display in the center. Bay H. Locked. Start decontamination? Theodore, standing right behind her, drew in a breath.
So, we know no one was here when we landed, at least,
she heard him say, and nodded in response. Cora pressed her finger against the screen, declining the message, and saw 2 more pop up. Damage to contamination room H, and break in contamination. Start emergency protocol. A cold shiver ran through her body, and she would have nearly screamed as Theodore's hand suddenly touched her shoulder. Whirling around, she shot him a dirty glance, but his eyes were looking past her and at another screen. Cora shifted her body to see as well, and found a video feed on one of the other displays, showing movement. The picture wasn't great, but the figure in the video was easily identifiable. It was a human being, lying on what looked like pavement outside the building. Cora felt a chill. There There was something wrong with them. They weren't completely still. They moved. Something black was covering their back as their hands scratched the ground.
I think we should get out of here,
Cora whispered, then heard her crewmate breathing in sharply. The sound of the person outside drawing their fingernails across the floor persisted. But it wasn't coming from a speaker. Cora looked back and could see Theodore's eyes growing wide. He jumped away from her and raced toward the wall, while she still couldn't understand what was going on. That sound. It was strange, she thought, then looked again at the screen hanging on the wall. Movement drew her eyes. Not up to the camera feed, but down. Behind the other row of computers, something moved. A shoe, she thought, then felt the coldest chill of her life. Black spikes were sticking out of its heel, forming a ridge up the leg. Cora stepped back just as the first growl reached her ears. The foot got pulled in, and the thing hissed again. She could hear it, crawling, turning around behind the row. What the hell was going on here? Cora felt someone touching her shoulder and screamed, then looked back and could see Theodore standing there, a fire extinguisher in his hands. He was holding it like a weapon. Cora looked back and could see a man crawling out from behind the row. She could feel goosebumps breaking out all over her body. This guy looked strange, sick. Something that seemed to be black thorns was sticking out of his skin and clothing all over his body. It formed a ridge from the tip of his head down his spine, while on its face, the spikes seemed far more random. She could see two tusk-like black things coming from his mouth. What the fuck? Cora hissed, and heard the figure whimpering in response. It moved again, crawled fully around the corner while staring at her. Her mind screamed at her to turn and run away. This thing was dangerous, sick and twisted. It hissed again and suddenly jumped. Cora screamed, then felt Theodore's hand pulling her back as he ran toward it. She watched him raise the fire extinguisher as the thing growled, then shot forward again and grabbed him by the leg. Her crewmate howled and brought his weapon down, just as the figure's open mouth reached his leg. She heard it clearly. The sickening crunch as the fire extinguisher hit the thing on the head. The sound of something hard and stone-like breaking as the spike burst under the impact. Then a wailing noise as the monster fell to the floor. Theodore was still screaming as he pulled up his weapon and brought it down again and again. A crunching noise reverberated from the walls, while Cora could do nothing but stand and watch. This planet had gone insane, she thought. Something really bad had happened here. With the last hit, she watched Theodore split the thing's head apart before he stumbled back and let out a loud howl.
It got me,
he cried.
Cora, it bit me.
The words snapped her out of a trance, and she shot forward to help him. Theodore hopped up on the console as she pulled his leg higher to take a closer look. There were holes in the leg of his pants, but no blood. She already wanted to give him the all clear, then stopped herself as her fingers touched the tears in the cloth. Yeah, there was no blood. But through the holes she could see something else. A black mass covering 2 spots on the skin. Theodore cried out in pain and grabbed his own leg. He fell from the console and hit the ground while still screaming for his life.
Let me look.
Cora spat at him, but he couldn't even hear her, it seemed. She tried grabbing hold of him once more, then quickly pulled back her hand as she saw it. There, above the original wounds, something black and looking like a thorn was sticking out of his leg. More and more of those things seemed to push against the cloth from beneath. It was growing. The black stuff was forming inside his leg. Cora jumped back, and her eyes met his. Theodore's face was a mask of pain and terror. What should she do? What could she even do? How could she help him? She had no answers for those questions. Looked around, but all she could see were different monitors showing other feeds from inside the building. There were more of those things. Everywhere, slowly starting to move.
Run!
She suddenly heard Theodore's voice, who was still holding onto his leg for dear life. Another spike had broken through his pants, this one just below the knee. Cora couldn't stop staring. This stuff, it was spreading so quickly.
Get the fuck out of here!
Her crewmate howled again, and this time she managed to shake her head.
I'll carry you down,
Cora replied, but the look on the man's face told her already that there would be no discussion. The new spike broke through his pants, this one just above the knee. He was growling. There was still no blood.
Go! Now!
Theodore managed to groan between noises of pain. But the ship... She still needed to deactivate the clamps. Cora took a step toward the console, and suddenly could see her crewmate rolling over, then jumping up on one leg. Spit was running down his chin.
I'll take care of the clamps. You go.
His voice almost broke while he hissed the words, now holding onto his leg with both arms. Camera feeds flickered across the screen, showing movement everywhere.
Go! Now!
She heard him hiss, as he almost collapsed onto the console. The black thorn was coming out of his thigh, stabbing through his pants. There was nothing she could do for him. She knew it, and he did too.
I'll send help,
Cora promised, and watched him shoot her another glance. The pain and fear in it almost broke her heart, but she turned around and started to run. Theodore screamed again inside the room as she raced out of the center and back to the walkway. The building wasn't as quiet anymore. She could hear bodies moving. Cora ignored the sound. Right now, she could do nothing but run, she told herself. The elevator was up ahead. She could feel sweat dripping from her skin as she reached it and hammered the button to open the door. Somewhere behind her, fingers over the ground, she could hear growling coming from the other offices. The elevator opened, and Cora jumped inside, pressing the button for the first floor as quickly as possible. She could feel her heartbeat in her head as she stood there, breathing hard. Far too slowly, the doors closed, and the elevator began to travel down. Cora could see them now. There were sick people on the second floor, their skin pierced by those black thorns. They were moving around, and as soon as they saw the glass elevator, some of them raced toward it. Her fingers still continued pressing the button for the first floor.
Please don't stop,
she cried in her mind. The elevator passed by the door of the second floor, and Cora could see them on the other side of the glass. Their fingers were scratching the closed door while those black protrusions scraped across the ground. They looked like monsters. Cora could feel herself getting sick. What if some of them were waiting downstairs? If even one of them touched her, she would be dead. She could hear a loud scream far away and felt another chill. Theodore. Maybe. Possibly. She just hoped and prayed that he was able to deactivate the clamps. The elevator reached the first floor, and Cora held her breath. Down here, the area was still deserted. A stroke of luck, she thought, and waited for the door to open. The second she stepped outside, Cora could hear the growling from across the room. There, by the front door, were 3 of those things slowly moving on their hands and knees. They noticed her as well. She could hear their sounds changing, the growling turning shriller as her footsteps echoed through the building. Shit, she thought, and felt her heart almost stopping. Cora ran. It didn't matter, she told herself. If she stopped now, they would get her anyway. The door with the letter H on it was to her left. She sprinted toward it and could see those things now doing the same. It was a race. Cora knew she couldn't stop. They should be slower, her mind told her. In the corner of her eye, she could see them gaining ground. Their movement was strange. A hopping that seemed to dislocate their joints every time they started to run again. This black stuff had done something to them. Changed them. The door she needed to get through was just ahead. Cora closed her eyes and continued to run. The sound of her footsteps echoed around her like gunshots, followed by the growls of 3 of those monsters. She reached the door first, hit the handle with her elbow, and almost screamed as it opened, oh so slowly. Cora couldn't wait. She pressed herself through the still-forming gap, stumbled and almost fell, but kept herself upright at the last moment. Those things were so close behind. She knew it, could hear it. They were coming. Cora hurried along the empty corridor. At least there was no chance anymore of those things coming up in front of her. She could see the door to the quarantine room now. The gap was still there. All she needed to do was escape. A growl coming from her back made her scream as she heard this thing jump off the floor and scrape along the ground, not even 2 steps behind her. It was so close already. Cora forced herself to keep looking forward. The gap in the door was right ahead, just a tiny bit more. She could hear another one of those things jump. It missed her by a hair. Just a tiny bit more, Cora screamed in her mind. All she needed was another few seconds. The thing behind her growled and shot forward. She could feel the air moving, touching her neck. The gap was right there. He wouldn't fit through. Cora cried out as she heard another growl and the sound of those black spikes scraping over the floor. It would lunge for her again, get her in a matter of seconds. She jumped the moment she heard the thing doing the same. Cora felt her feet leaving the ground, and a hot breath on her neck. Pulling in her shoulders, she aimed for the gap. This one would hurt, she thought, and braced herself. If she didn't make it, it would be all over for her anyway. There was nothing she could do then. Her shoulder slipped through the small gap, followed by her head. She could feel the metal scratching her ears, cried out as she felt blood on her cheek, then fell forward and hit the gap with her hips. Pain radiated through her, but Cora had no time to think. She looked back and could see her legs, and behind them, the deformed face of one of the monsters. It was coming toward her. The memories of what happened to Theodore popped into her mind. His screams, the black spikes poking out of his skin. Cora howled and pulled in her legs just as her shoulder crashed to the floor. Her feet passed through the gaps a moment before the first of those things collided with the door.
Hurry!
The voice hadn't come from her, but from the speakers in the room.
Cora! I can't hold it any longer. Run!
It was Theodore. His strained voice, filled with pain and fear, was coming from the security systems hidden in the corners of the room. She rolled over and came back to her feet. The monsters were throwing themselves at the door. Their spikes were breaking against the metal as a hand shot through the gap. She could hear the door groaning as something started to push it. Cora rolled over and came to her feet. The door leading to her ship was up ahead and standing open. Was this Theodore's doing as well? She hoped so. Otherwise, those things would follow her to her vessel. Cora groaned and started to run again. Her arms and legs hurt, and even her ears felt hot and scraped. She needed to get out of here. Behind her, the door groaned again as metal got pushed against metal. Those things were still growling. Cora ran and coughed, past the door leading to the ship, and heard it snapping shut behind her. She turned and could see the other door through a small window. It was getting pushed open.
Run!
Theodore's voice cried through the speakers. A loud hissing sound filled the air. He was activating the emergency protocol, Cora realized, turned and started to sprint. She reached the ship, jumped inside, and raced to the cockpit.
Please let the clamps be open.
Cora howled in her mind. The ship came alive as her fingers almost flew over the screens. She could feel herself getting pressed into the chair. Thrusters pushed it off and into the air, just as a loud rumbling filled the area. Cora could feel herself almost flying out of her seat as the ship made a turn and started to accelerate. The feed from the camera pointed below showed her the inferno racing through the whole port. It was blowing up, would be turned to ash together with those monsters, she thought. But Cora didn't let out a single sigh of relief. Looking down at the ever smaller getting surface, she could see it now as well. The planet as a whole was burning. Everywhere, big black clouds of smoke were filling the horizon. Theodore was dead. She had just escaped through sheer luck. She opened the communications link and spoke 4 words.
Planet Destea has fallen.